There's a belief among Christians that Satan was the most beautiful of all angels and that he led worship in heaven. Here's the bad news. If you missed the previous episode, we covered the myth that Lucifer is not another name for Satan, and that the Bible never says that Satan was thrown out of heaven. In this episode, we're going to cover the claim that Satan was the most beautiful angel and that he was made of instruments and played music in heaven. This misinterpretation is found in Ezekiel 28:13, specifically in the King James Version, which says, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created." Do you know what tabrets are? Tabrets are an ancient form of tambourines, and the pipes were thought to have been something like a pan flute. The King James says those instruments were prepared in thee. Many have understood that phrase to mean that the instruments were a part of this creature's biology, as if it were built into its skeleton. How many of you have heard that theory? In 1982, the New King James Version changed the wording to say, "The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created." All of a sudden, the King James translators changed their theology. Now the instruments are no longer a part of the creature's body. They now seem to be regular instruments that were given to the creature when it was created. However, the evolution of the theology of this verse does not stop there. There has been debate among scholars over the meaning of two Hebrew words within verse 13, toph and nekeb, which have been translated to tabrets and pipes. The discourse is due to the sudden change in theme within verse 13. The verse begins by describing precious stones covering the creature. Then, without reason, it changes the subject away from the stones to musical instruments. Upon further study, scholars have agreed that a more accurate translation and understanding of these words are mount and setting, in relation to the stones being mounted and set on the creature, rather than musical instruments being made from the creature or given to the creature. The New International Version translates this verse as, "Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared." The New American Bible says, "Their mounts and settings were worked in gold, fashioned for you the day you were created." The ESV, the New Living, the New Revised, and many more modern translations agree that the verse is not describing musical instruments, rather mounts and settings. This understanding of the word toph and nekeb provides a more coherent flow of thought within verse 13 that begins and ends in describing the precious stones. With this new acquired knowledge, I hope you agree that the myth of the creature being described in Ezekiel 28:13 as being a musician or worship leader is no longer applicable or relevant. Now, the last myth that we're going to debunk in this episode is the myth that this verse is even talking about Satan at all, or some sort of fallen angel. We will begin, as we usually do, by adding context. Ezekiel chapter 28 is divided into 4 sections. Section 1 is verse 1 through 10. Ezekiel is prophesying to a single person known as the Prince of Tyre. We know this prince is human because in verse 2 it says, "You are only a man and not a god." And in verse 9 and 10 it says, "Will you then boast, I am a god, to those who kill you? To them you will be no god, but merely a man. You will die like an outcast." Section 2 is verses 11 through 19. Ezekiel is prophesying to the city of Tyre as a whole, which he refers to as the king of Tyre. We know Ezekiel is not speaking to a single person because in verse 13 and in verse 15, he uses the phrase, "the day you were created," which is a strange way to talk about someone's birth. People are born, cities are created. Then in verse 16, Ezekiel writes, "Your commerce and businesses were full of lawlessness, and you sinned." This could refer to a king who ruled over all the commerce within the city. However, it's very unlikely that a king is described as part of the working class. A king is usually classified as royalty and is not associated with work or trade. And finally, in verse 19, Ezekiel writes, "You have come to a terrible end, and you will exist no more." Saying someone exists no more is a strange way of talking about a person dying, especially since we previously read that the prince of Tyre was killed and died. Ezekiel is clearly describing a city no longer existing rather than a person dying. Otherwise, he would have said that the person was killed or had died. Section 3 of chapter 28 is verses 20 through 24, where Ezekiel is prophesying to the entire city of Sidon. And section 4 is the final two verses, 25 and 26, where Ezekiel prophesies to the entire city of Israel. So to recap, section 1 of chapter 28 is referring to a single person. However, sections 2, 3, and 4 are unquestionably referring to entire cities. Even the next chapter, chapter 29, is referring to the entire city of Egypt as a whole, not to a person. Isaiah is known for speaking and prophesying to entire cities or to individual kings of those cities. If we go back to Ezekiel 28:13, we will see that it is found in section 2, meaning that the entire verse is talking about the city of Tyre as a whole. It is not talking about a human king, rather the rule and control of the city and all of its officials and the ruling class. It is talking about the corruption and evil of the collective sin of everyone in the city of Tyre. There is no evidence or reason to believe that Ezekiel is prophesying to Satan or any fallen angel. The purpose of a prophecy is to make people aware of their sins so that they can turn away from their sin and move towards God. If you believe in Satan, do you really think it would be productive or even reasonable for Ezekiel to tell Satan that he is sinning and needs to turn to God? That's actually such an incredibly comical thought. Why would anyone waste their breath ministering to Satan? Isaiah is not doing that. He is ministering to nations and to kings who rule over nations to turn away from Satan and to start following God. Satan is not the subject of these prophecies. Isaiah is not speaking to Satan in the same way that Isaiah is not speaking to God. He's speaking to people and to nations. He's trying to convince them to move their loyalty from Satan and towards God. So, there you have it. Ezekiel 28:13 is not talking about Lucifer. It's not talking about Satan being a musical angel. It's not talking about Satan being beautiful. Isaiah isn't talking about angels at all. He is talking about the corruption of the city of Tyre.